Okay, thanks very much. Good to see you, everybody. My name is Matthew. I'm the lead pastor here, and we're going to be talking today about a subject called self-control, which is part of our series on the fruit of the Spirit. Just a quick reminder, we have some material that accompanies this series. We're well over halfway through it now. But if you haven't got a copy of that, I'd encourage you to grab one. You can download one online. I think we still have copies outside in the lobby area. I'm going to reference a few things from the material for this week. You know, we have these messages on Sundays, and then there are discussion questions and different exercises and practices for the week time. Most of those are oriented towards discussion groups, and we have groups here at Cedar that meet during the week. But even if you're not one of those groups, which is fine, there's some great exercises to do, and as I mentioned, I'm going to refer to a couple of those today. So do grab a copy of that. Let's look at the first of our scriptures for today, which is one we've looked at every time throughout this series. This is where we get this term, the fruit of the Spirit, from. It's in Galatians chapter 5, a letter that one of the early Christian leaders, Paul, wrote to the churches in Galatia. He says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." And we're going to be talking today about that last one on the list, self-control. We've not taken these in order, so we're not at the end of the series. But I think the next two we're going to do, Cedar mentioned next week we're taking a little break and we're going to go out and serve our community. So that's, you know, as much an important part of what we do together as anything we're going to do today. But the week after that we'll touch on faithfulness. And these two, self-control and faithfulness, I think in many respects kind of look back on all the other fruit qualities. If you like, self-control could be viewed as how do we live our life in line with the kind of things we've been talking about over the last few weeks. Love and joy and peace and patience and kindness. How can we be controlled in that kind of manner? Same with faithfulness, we might say, faithfulness is about how do we go on living like that? How do we commit to that? How do we make that a regular part of our lives? How do we make that the norm? The final week, by the way, of the series is going to be on gratefulness. That will lead us into Thanksgiving, which isn't one of the qualities that's in those couple of verses. But, you know, we've said all along, we don't think this is an exhaustive list. And I think we've probably seen already that there's lots of overlap between these qualities. So, you know, we've got to be careful about being too definitive. And the journey goes on, right? There's lots of qualities to our spirituality that we want to engage in and participate in and pursue. So, you know, it's not like that's going to end with this list or end with this series. A couple of things about self-control before we sort of dive into it I want to mention. The first one is this, that I think there's a tendency and perhaps a danger even with this particular subject matter for us to fall back into we've just got to try harder, we've got to do better, perhaps feeling guilty, feeling shameful about certain things going on in our lives. Because, you know, as we're going to find out, I think, we're all out of control in various ways, right? And none of us exhibit self-control perfectly. So there's things in our lives that are out of control. It's going to be fine because we can keep those to ourselves for now, okay? So no worries there. But we're going to try and be at least honest with ourselves about this. And the tendency then can be, we just need to do better, right? And we've said all along, and in fact the whole tone of this letter that Paul is writing is not about just trying harder, not about guilt, not about shame as a motivator. It's about engaging with the positive Spirit of God in our lives and letting that motivate us and drive us to a different, more healthy, more wholesome, more productive kind of life. Okay, so let's not, whatever we think about this subject this morning, whatever I say, let's remember this is not about guilt. This is not about shame. The other thing I would say about it is I think that we often view self-control, particularly in a religious setting like ours, we often view self-control as kind of all about what we shouldn't do, right? It's all about a restrained life, if you like, about don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. You know, and that tends to be kind of the mantra of religion, right? It's about negative very often, or it can be. But let's look at the same verses that we just looked at in a different translation from the original language, the Greek. And this is a much more modern translation. We use it frequently here. It's called the Message. It's still based on the original manuscripts. It's still making a very good attempt to give a true meaning. It's just using more modern language. Here's what it says. For what happens when we live God's way? He brings gifts into our lives in much the same way that fruit appears in an orchard. Things like affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity. We can probably recognize some of the fruit qualities that we've been talking about previously. We develop a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, and a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, and able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. Okay, so that ending part there, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely, that has a very positive connotation, right? So self-control, which is, that's the translation of self-control. The word in the original Greek is egrateia. It's been translated here in a much more positive way. I think self-control is positive, but what I'm saying, I guess, is we have connotations with it that tend to be negative. What self-control is all about is living a productive life. It's about being who we really want to be. It's about fulfilling all our potential as human beings, as loving, kind, patient human beings, right? It's about all of that rather than about what we should be doing. Now, we also know, of course, that things get in the way of us being those kind of people. Things get in the way of us being who we want to be, right? We have different weaknesses and issues going on in our lives that have at times formed into habits or patterns that hold us back. Some of those are really obvious, at least to other people. Some of them are not so obvious. So it certainly involves looking at issues that are inhibitive to us. But we've got to bear in mind that this is about setting us free to live life and live it to the full, as Jesus talks about. So let's bear those two things in mind. No guilt, and this is about freedom and really living life rather than about being restrained or suppressed. Okay. I mentioned the word egrateia. The word egrateia means, it has this sense of mastery, of discipline, of strength. Okay, so it's a very positive word that is translated self-control. Let's look at a couple of instances where this same writer, Paul, uses it in another letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth. The first one says this: do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Okay, so he's using the same language there for self-control. Now he's using a metaphor of athletics, of running, and Paul uses a lot of metaphors, and like all metaphors, sometimes they break down eventually, right? I think there's good and bad ways of looking at the spiritual journey as a race. Anyway, we won't get into that, but what he's saying there is, be positive with your life, train your life, be disciplined, be strong in the way that you live. And there's this sort of athletic, positive connotation that we've just been talking about this term. He also uses it in the other context of being more careful and dealing with issues in our lives that are inhibitive or problematic. In 1 Corinthians 7, he says this: now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, by the way, this is a little bit of patriarchy coming through here, so we just have to bear with that. To the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. What he means is he doesn't want people having illegal sex all over the place. So that's his way of dealing with that. But the point he's getting at here is that there are issues in our lives that kind of can get out of control, right? Sexuality is one of those, right? I can think back to a time in my life where I would say I was out of control sexually, and it wasn't a positive thing. It seemed positive at the time, but it was. Who's laughing there? I can hear something chuckling to himself. I'm talking about a really dark period of my life. Anyway, but it was pretty destructive. And I think we can all relate to that. Maybe not necessarily sexually, probably, but we can think about patterns and urges and habits and behaviors in our life that can be somewhat out of control, right? Let me share an example of one of these with you. I think if we could put up the next slide. And I'm realizing now that I shouldn't have just said anything about sexuality just now, because you're going to get all the kind of wrong impression about what I'm about to say. But did you know it's the 20th anniversary of Tomb Raider coming out? Anybody ever played Tomb Raider before? Oh my gosh. Am I? Okay, well we're going to get into confession later on, okay, as part of this issue of self-control. This is the only video game I ever played, Tomb Raider 2. I didn't even play the first one, but thank you for those of you who did put your hand up. But it's apparently the 20th anniversary of Tomb Raider 1. 1997, I was living in Cincinnati, working in the church, and busy, great experience, but very busy, quite a stressful kind of job. Unlike this one, which is a piece of cake. No, not really. At all. And I was getting kind of pretty anxious, pretty stressed out. So my lovely wife, Lisa, bought me a PlayStation. It was the first kind of PlayStations. And with the PlayStation came Tomb Raider 2. Now, I didn't think too much of it, despite the cover. I didn't really think too much. I just thought, it's one of those video games. I won't be too much. But she thought playing a video game might help me kind of just have some relaxation, that kind of thing. It opened up a whole new world to me. This was like Dungeons and Dragons on steroids. And I know you all played Dungeons and Dragons, okay? I'm not even going to ask you about that. Because it's, anybody who's played Dungeons? Yes. Well, this was like, you had to problem solve, you got into a new scenario, and all these things would just open up. And to me, and this is 1997, the graphics were amazing. Obviously, compared to today, not the case. But the trouble was, this thing that was meant to help me relax became an obsession. And my wife would have to come down at like 3 a.m. and peel my hands off the controller. And bear in mind that it took me about a month to work out that you could save. I didn't realize you could save. So I just go all the way back to the beginning again when I got killed. And then somebody said, hey, you can get a memory stick, And I was like, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. So I went out and got a memory stick. And it became a problem. Actually, I think, yes, here it is. I have a copy of my original Tomb Raider 2 game. It's probably worth a lot of money now. But even though I still have it, I gave it up. I finished it first. I finished the whole thing. But then I just decided I cannot play these games. I can't do that. I was 30 or so at the time, and I felt like a teenager or something. I just could not do that. It plugged into something in me that was out of control, right? Some of you may be able to relate to that. Around video games, you may be able to relate to it around other issues. We have these things in our lives that aren't necessarily wrong. We can take that image down, by the way. That's kind of a shame. Thank you. They may not necessarily be wrong, but they kind of take over, right? And they become an obsession, or they become something that begins to govern our life, or take up way too much time. If we stop and think about it, it's like we don't really want to be like that. We don't want to spend all that time on those things, or we don't want to react that way, or we don't want to respond that way. But it kind of feels like a pattern. It's just part of us now, right? We all wrestle and struggle with those kind of things, right? It seems like that's a normal part of our life. Now let's talk then about what can be out of control in our life. Let's think about some of the lack of control. Before we go there, I just want to mention that what we are not talking about today is suppressing our emotions or suppressing our reactions. Again, this isn't about guilt or shame. It's not about, I don't think we should be thinking about self-control as repression of feelings, repression of actions. Let's look at a verse actually. Again, the writer Paul, in a letter he wrote to Ephesus, he wrote a lot of letters, this guy. He says this, therefore each of you must put off falsehood, don't be fake, in other words, and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. So there's something he's talking about there, anger. Some of us might have a problem with anger, right? again, we won't do a show of hands, but probably I would imagine most of us have experienced anger that's got a bit out of control, right? Where we've reacted more strongly than we really wanted to, or in a way that's surprising to us. For some of us, that might be a real struggle. It might be a pattern, something we're trying to wrestle with and deal with. There's nothing wrong with anger. That emotional response of anger is a normal, natural response. It can become toxic, it can become negative, okay? So he's giving people permission to get angry. And he's saying, that's not sinning. And he's saying, don't be fake. In other words, he's saying, if you're angry, it's probably better to express it, but there's ways of expressing it, right? And there's not letting the sun go down in your anger, not letting anger persist, but resolving it. And there's healthy ways of dealing with anger. This is not a message about anger per se, so we're not going to dig too deep into that. But the point being, it would be a big mistake for us to go away with this message of self-control and start trying to suppress all these feelings. That's not what it's about. In fact, perhaps that's as much about as what it means to be out of control, right? When you think about some of us, right, are very expressive and we have emotional reactions. And the negative side of that, it's not hard for us to express our emotions. The negative side of that is that our life can become all about us and how we're feeling and how we're doing, and our emotions spill out in every situation and have a negative impact on other people. We need self-control. But on the other hand, for some of us, it's like life's all about us, and we're not going to be out of control, and we're going to remain safe and secure in our reactions by being very buttoned down. And that has a very negative impact on everybody else, because they don't know where we're coming from, they don't really know whether we care, they don't know, there's not an interact with us. We need more self-control to let ourselves go, to be our true selves, right? So it works both ways, and suppression of these things is as much a negative aspect of self-control or lack of self-control as all these other things that are spilling out of us. Okay, so we'll be in different places as regards to that equation, but let's not come away from this pushing emotions down. That's not what we're talking about here. Well, what are we talking about? I want us just to go back to the passage from the beginning, from Galatians 5, where Paul is talking about the fruit of the Spirit. Before that, he talks about what we might call the antifruit, or the product of living a life that's not full of God's Spirit. Okay, so this is the dark side. Oh, it's up there already. So here's what it says. The acts of the flesh, that's his metaphor for the opposite of the Spirit. The acts of the flesh are obvious. Sexual immorality, impurity and debauchery. That's a great word there, isn't it? Anybody into debauchery? I mean, who's going to confess to that one? Right? I mean, idolatry and witchcraft. Those first few might be trickier for us to kind of relate to. Hatred. We can relate to hatred, right? And sort of hate rising up in us and reaction. Discord, jealousy. That's one that kind of wells up within us. And that fits of rage, we kind of touched on that. Selfish ambition, where our selfishness and our competition kind of takes over, and we put people down, and we make decisions that kind of put us ahead rather than other people. Dissensions, factions, and envy, drunkenness, orgies. Anybody? For orgies? Anybody remember? And the like. I love the way he ends with that. Well, there you go. That's another one like with the fruit of the Spirit. We said there's no end to it. Well, there's no end to this list. Now let's look at it again in the Message version. We did that with the fruit of the Spirit. And it's sort of more modern language. And humor.